The taillights of Vincent's sedan disappeared around the corner of Sycamore Lane like two red eyes closing, and then there was nothing. No horn, no slowing, no final look in the rearview mirror. Just the ordinary afternoon, the sparrows bickering in the hedge, a neighbor's lawn mower 3 houses down, the smell of cut grass and someone's early supper drifting through a screened door, carrying on as if nothing of any consequence had just occurred on this sidewalk. Dorothy Callahan stood with her suitcase at her feet and let the silence settle around her the way a woman who has lived 78 years learns to let things settle. She did not cry. She had done her crying in private. In the months she had watched this day approach like a slow storm on the horizon, and she had made a quiet agreement with herself that she would not spend her tears on a sidewalk in front of strangers. Tears, she had long ago decided, were currency. You spent them on what was worth the price. What she felt instead was something older and harder than grief. It was the feeling of a woman who has carried other people's needs for so long that when those people finally walk away, the first sensation, before the hurt, before the anger, is the peculiar lightness of a body no longer asked to bend. She breathed in, she breathed out, she looked at her own hands. 19 years on this street, 19 winters and 19 Augusts. She knew the name of every dog on the block. She had watched the Hendersons' oak tree grow from a sapling she could have stepped over into something that shaded half the yard. She had painted that front door, the one they'd already changed. She'd noticed, when the new owner's representative came for the walkthrough, she had painted it the particular shade of blue she'd mixed herself because she couldn't find it in any store. A blue like the inside of a mussel shell, gone now. She had no plan to stand here and eulogize a house. She was not that kind of woman. Her right hand moved, as it sometimes did in moments of stress, to the inner breast pocket of her good wool coat, the navy one with the bone buttons that she had sewn herself 30 years ago now, when her hands were steadier and the thread came easily. Her fingers found what they always found there, a small iron key, approximately 2 inches long, the kind that might have once belonged to a diary or a jewelry box but felt, from the first moment it was pressed into her palm, as though it locked something far more serious than that. She took it out and held it in the flat of her hand, the way you hold a thing you are finally ready to truly look at. The iron was dark with age, warm from the heat of her body. The bow, the round top loop, was simple, unornamented, worn smooth by decades of handling. The blade was narrow and old-fashioned, cut with 2 small notches. It was not a beautiful key. It was a working key, made to open something specific by someone who needed that something kept closed. Her mother Aliner's face came to her then, as it always did when she held this key. Not Aliner as she'd been most of Dorothy's life, upright and capable in her kitchen, but Aliner at the end, lying in the narrow bed at the county hospital with the IV line in her thin wrist and the light going out of her eyes degree by degree, the way a candle burns down. She had gripped Dorothy's hand with what strength remained in her fingers, and those fingers had been strong. All her life they'd been strong. The fingers of a woman who had worked with her hands since she was 12 years old, and she had pressed the key into Dorothy's palm and closed her daughter's fist around it. There's a property, she had whispered, Millbrook Hollow, White House. You'll know the door. Don't let anyone else open it. Only you. And then the nurses had come and Dorothy had been ushered into the hallway, and when she came back her mother was sleeping, and by morning Evicted Callahan was gone. And there had been so much to do, the arrangements, the other children, the grief that sits on the chest like stone, and Dorothy had put the key in the pocket of her best coat and carried it there for 30 years without ever once driving to Millbrook Hollow, because there was always something. Always a child who needed her, a husband who needed her, a household that needed her, and the years had a way of piling up like leaves in a corner until you couldn't see the ground beneath them anymore. She closed her fist around the key now. I'm coming, she said quietly to no one, to Aliner, to herself, to whatever was waiting. She picked up her suitcase, and she began to walk. The number 7 bus ran from the center of Harlow Creek out toward the eastern edge of town, and Dorothy knew its schedule the way she knew her own hands. She had ridden it for years before she had a car, and she rode it now with her suitcase wedged between her ankles and her coat buttoned to the throat, watching the familiar streets give way to the less familiar ones. The small strip malls and the chain gas stations, and then the quieter stretches where the commercial sprawl petered out and Tennessee reasserted itself in the form of open fields and stands of cedar, and the particular quality of afternoon light in this part of the country that turns everything the color of old honey. She transferred to the 14 at the junction, a bus she had not ridden in years, and rode it another 20 minutes to the place where Millbrook Hollow Road left the county route and headed south. The driver, a young man with kind eyes and a GPS unit he clearly didn't trust, looked at her when she asked if this was her stop. "You sure about that, ma'am? Ain't much down that road." "I know," she said and stepped off. She walked the final mile with her suitcase rolling on the cracked asphalt behind her, the sound of its wheels a steady rhythm in the late afternoon quiet. The road was lined with old-growth trees, white oak and hickory mostly, with the occasional tulip poplar sending its crown so high above the canopy that it seemed to belong to a different sky. The undergrowth was deep and green and tangled with honeysuckle, and that smell hit her before anything else did, the heavy, almost drugging sweetness of wild honeysuckle in the heat, a smell she associated, for reasons she couldn't articulate, with something older than her own memory. It smelled like the summers of her childhood, like her mother's hands, like something just out of reach. And then the road curved, and she saw the house. It sat on the left side of the road, set back from a low stone wall that had been losing its argument with time for several decades. The clapboard siding had once been white and was now the color of old bone, peeling in long strips that curled away from the walls like pages of a book. The front porch sagged at the left end where a support post had given way. The windows 4 in front, 2 upstairs, were still intact, which struck her as almost miraculous, though their glass was so layered with grime and condensation that they reflected the afternoon light rather than admitting it, giving the house a blind, inward-looking quality, like a face with closed eyes. The yard was spectacular in its wildness. Decades of unmowed growth had allowed everything to do exactly as it pleased, and what had pleased it was this: a riot of goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace and ironweed, great thick ropes of wisteria climbing the left side of the porch, a persimmon tree near the stone wall that was heavy with small unripe fruit, and in every direction the honeysuckle, braiding through the fence posts, climbing the cedar nearest the house, filling every breath with that impossible sweetness. Dorothy stood at the edge of the property and simply looked. The house was a ruin by practical measure, but it was standing. After 30 years of standing here alone and untended and forgotten, it was still standing. Something in her chest that had been clenched all day began, very slightly, to release. The sound of a screen door reached her from across the road, and she turned. On the porch of a small brick ranch house, tidy, with a well-kept garden, a stack of firewood against the side wall, an elderly black man had risen from a rocking chair and was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. He was thin and very upright, with white hair close cropped to his skull and the deliberate movements of a man who has learned to make every motion count. He was, she guessed, at least 80 years old. He was watching her the way you watch someone you are not entirely sure is real. He raised one hand in a slow, tentative wave. She crossed the road. His name, he told her when she came up to the porch, was Samuel Gryce, and he had lived across from that white house for 53 years. He brought her water from the kitchen, a tall glass with ice, which she accepted with real gratitude, and he told her she was the spitting image of Evicted Callahan, God rest her, and that he had wondered, more times than he could count, whether any of Evicted's people would ever come. They sat on his porch in the low amber light of late afternoon, the kind of light that softens the sharp edges of things, and Dorothy told him, briefly and without dramatics, what her day had been. Samuel listened with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the white house across the road, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Alina would have had something to say about those children of yours, he said finally. What would she have said? He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. She'd have said some people are always hungry, and some people are always generous, and the trouble is the generous ones spend so much time feeding the hungry ones that they forget to feed themselves. Dorothy looked at her water glass. That sounds like her. It was her, Samuel said. Those were her exact words. She said them to me once, sitting right here on this porch, about 20 years before she died. He paused. She worried about you, specifically. She said you were the most generous one and therefore the most at risk. Dorothy said nothing. The honeysuckle came to them on the evening breeze, faint and sweet, and somewhere in the trees behind Samuel's house, a wood thrush was making its fluted, spiral sound, that particular song that has never failed to make the heart feel briefly and inexplicably large. Tell me about the property, Dorothy said. Tell me what you know. Samuel looked at her for a moment with those clear, careful eyes. Then he began. He told her what he knew in the measured way of a man who has held a secret long enough to know exactly how much it weighs. He spoke slowly and without embellishment, because the facts on their own were enough. Evicted Callahan had purchased the 2-acre property at 14 Millbrook Hollow Road in the spring of 1961, when Dorothy was 13 years old. She had paid for it in full, $840, which in 1961 was a sum that represented, Samuel said carefully, the earnings of approximately 8 years of taking in laundry and doing alterations and pressing other people's shirts and letting out other people's hems and making other people's children's Easter dresses, all of it done in secret, in the hours before dawn and after dark, in a back room of the house that Dorothy's father believed was used only for storage. Dorothy stared at him. She had a sewing room, she said slowly. I thought it was just where she kept her things. She had a business, Samuel said, a quiet one, 40 years of quiet work. He looked out at the White House. Your father was not a man who believed women should have money of their own, so she didn't tell him. She told no one. She bought that property in her own name, paid the taxes on it every year through a post office box downtown, kept the deed in the attic of that house, and she watched it and she waited. Waited for what? For the right time, and then she got sick, and the right time never came, and she had to make do with what she had, which was a key and a daughter she trusted. He looked at Dorothy directly. She told me the property might be worth something to you someday. She said, if Dorothy ever comes, tell her to go up to the attic. Tell her everything she needs is there. Dorothy sat very still in the rocking chair, the glass of water cold between her palms, the wood thrush singing in the trees behind her, the white house across the road looking back at her with its blind, patient windows. She never told me, Dorothy said. For 30 years I've carried that key, and she never told me what it was for. She whispered it to you, Samuel said gently. At the end, she told me she whispered it. She said she hoped you'd hear her. Dorothy looked down at her hands. The iron key was in her fist without her remembering reaching for it. She thought the property might have value by now, Samuel continued. She told me the land alone was worth keeping, but she died without a will. I think she meant to write one, and time ran out. The property's been sitting in legal no man's land for 30 years, county records showing it in her name, no one filing for inheritance, no taxes in arrears because there was still money in a tin box in the attic that she'd arranged for a lawyer friend of hers, old man Peterson, been dead himself for 20 years, to keep the taxes paid until the money ran out. He paused. From what I understand, the money runs out this year. Dorothy looked up. This year. End of October, Samuel said, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile. You cut it close, Miss Dorothy, but you're here. The wood thrush sang. The honeysuckle breathed its sweetness into the evening air. Across the road, the white house stood in its patient, peeling silence and waited for her to come inside. She crossed the road alone the next morning, in the thin gold light of early September, with Samuel watching from his porch and the key warm in her hand. The front door had swollen in its frame over the decades, and she had to put her shoulder to it, but it opened. And the smell that came out to meet her, dust and old wood and something underneath that was unmistakably the smell of her childhood, some combination of cedar and hand soap, and a particular brand of starch her mother had used, hit her in the center of the chest with the force of a physical thing. She stood in the doorway and breathed. The front room was small and low-ceilinged, with a brick fireplace along one wall and wide plank floorboards that creaked enormously under her first step and then settled, as if the house were sighing. There was almost no furniture, a wooden chair with a broken rung, a small table, but there were still photographs on the walls. She saw them and stopped walking entirely. They were photographs she recognized. Family photographs, the formal kind from the 1950s, women in their good dresses, men in their Sunday suits, children arranged in front of hedges with the stiff posture of children who have been told not to squirm. She knew those faces. Her Uncle Raymond with his mustache. Her Aunt Pearl is in the hat with the feathers. A photograph of her parents, Eleanor and Howard Callahan, very young, very serious, that she had never seen before, taken before Dorothy herself existed, when her parents were still only becoming who they would be. Her mother had put these here, had hung them on the walls of this secret house, this house no one knew about, this house that was hers alone. Dorothy pressed her fingertips to the glass of her parents' photograph. I didn't know you at all, she thought, and then, more quietly, or maybe I knew exactly who you were, and I just didn't know the whole story. The staircase was steeper than she expected, and the banister held, which she was grateful for. She moved through the upstairs rooms, 2 small bedrooms, both empty, their windows glazed with years of grime, afternoon light pushing through in long dusty columns that made the rooms feel somehow sacred, and found the attic door at the end of the narrow hallway. It was a small door, barely 5 feet high, with a keyhole of the old iron kind set into a simple plate. The wood around the plate was darker than the rest, worn smooth from handling, and Dorothy understood with sudden certainty that her mother had opened this door many times, had stood in this hallway, in this narrow house, alone, and opened this door and gone up into whatever lay beyond it. Her hand was trembling slightly. She had not expected it to tremble. She put the key in the lock. It turned. The attic was low and warm and smelled of something that was almost incense, old cedar, she realized, cedar lining the eaves, a method of preservation that had kept the worst of the insects and the damp at bay for all these years. There was a single small window at the far end, thick with grime, but enough light came through it to see by. In the center of the attic floor, carefully arranged on a piece of oilcloth, as if set out deliberately for exactly this moment, were 4 things. Dorothy went to her knees in front of them and did not realize she had done so until she felt the floorboards under her. The first was a letter, several pages, handwritten in the careful, upright script that Dorothy would have known anywhere, the handwriting of a woman who had taught herself to write beautifully, because she believed your handwriting said something about your character. The second was a folded document, official in its weight and texture, with a raised seal in one corner. She did not open it yet. The third was a second document, thinner, with the name of an insurance company printed across the top in faded ink. The fourth was a tin box, a Christmas cookie tin, red with a faded winter scene, with a folded piece of cloth tied around it with a length of kitchen twine. Dorothy picked up the letter first, and she read it. My darling Dorothy, if you are reading this, then you heard me, and you found your way here, and I am so glad. I am so glad. I want to explain what I did and why I did it, because you deserve an explanation, and I was not able to give you one while I was living. I started saving when you were 2 years old. Your father was a good man in many ways, but he was a man of his time, and his time told him that money was his and that a woman's job was to need him for it. I decided early in our marriage that I would not be a woman who needed anyone for anything if I could help it. I began taking in laundry and doing alterations. I told your father the back room was storage. He never questioned it. He was not a man who looked too closely at the rooms he didn't use. I saved for 8 years. I bought this property in 1961 for $840. It was mine. I paid the taxes on it every year. I watched it, and I waited, and I kept my mouth closed because I had learned that the things you keep quiet are the things that stay yours. I always meant to tell you when the time was right. The time was never right. Then I was dying, and there was only the key and a minute with you in that hospital room, and I pray to God it was enough. There is a deed in your hands, the original deed to this property, in my name. A lawyer named Priya or someone like her will know what to do with it. Find someone who helps people like us. There is also an insurance document. I took out a small policy 30 years ago, nomming you as my sole beneficiary. I never told you because I didn't want you to wait for me to die. The amount is not large, but it is yours. And there is the tin box. Everything in it is yours. Dorothy, I need you to know this. I worked 40 years in that back room, and I was not sorry for 1 hour of it. Those were my hours. That was my work. That was my money and my property and my secret and my freedom. And I kept it for you, my most generous one, my most giving child, because I always knew, that someday you would need a door that only you had the key to. I love you, I always have, more than I was ever able to say. Your mother, Eleanor's. Dorothy read the letter twice. The second time she read it aloud, in the quiet of the cedar-smelling attic, to the dusty air and the light coming through the dirty window and whatever else was listening. She opened the deed and ran her fingers over the raised seal and the typed words. Eleanor Me Callahan, sole owner. The legal description of the property, the date, April 3, 1961, her mother's signature, clear and upright and unmistakable. She set it down and opened the insurance document, and when she read the accumulated value printed on the second page, she closed her eyes. She untied the kitchen twine from the tin box and opened it. Inside, wrapped in what she recognized as her mother's good apron, white cotton, embroidered at the hem with small blue flowers, the apron she had worn for every Sunday dinner of Dorothy's childhood, were bundles of paper money in small denominations, banded together with rubber bands gone brittle with age, and 3 series EE savings bonds, each one purchased over 50 years ago, each one worth substantially more than its original face value. Dorothy sat on the attic floor of her mother's secret house with her mother's tin box in her lap and the letter in her hands, and she wept. She wept the way women who have not permitted themselves to weep for a very long time eventually weep, in silence, without performance, with the full weight of everything that had been held in finally releasing. When it passed, she sat for a long time in the quiet. You knew, she said aloud to the empty attic. You always knew what was coming. You planned for it 30 years before it happened. She looked up at the cedar-lined ceiling, at the bars of light coming through the filthy window. I hear you, Mama, I hear you. She wrapped the documents carefully in the apron, placed them back in the tin box, and carried everything downstairs in her arms the way you carry something that cannot be replaced. The legal aid office was a narrow storefront on the main street of Harlow Creek, with a hand-painted sign in the window, and a waiting room that smelled of coffee, and the particular exhaustion of people who need help and have learned to wait for it without complaint. Dorothy sat in that waiting room for 2 hours before a door opened, and a young woman appeared and called her name. Priya Anand was 34 years old, with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the manner of someone who has seen so many injustices that she has converted her outrage into methodology. She shook Dorothy's hand once firmly, sat her down, and began to ask questions in the precise, unhurried way of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking for. She looked at the deed, she looked at the insurance document, she read Aliner's letter once, set it down, and adjusted her glasses. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "I need you to understand what you have here." She explained Tennessee inheritance law in plain language. When a property owner dies without a formal will but holds a clear deed in their name, and when there exists an only surviving child with a documented relationship, the estate recovery process, though it requires legal work and carries no guarantee of speed, is, in cases like this one, winnable. The deed was clean. The taxes were paid. The paper trail was unambiguous. Zelina Callahan had owned this property, had paid for it, had maintained it, and had documented her ownership. 6 weeks, Priya said, possibly 8. I can't promise less than that, but I can tell you that I've resolved cases with less documentation than this. She closed the folder and looked at Dorothy over her glasses. Where are you staying? With a neighbor, Dorothy said, Samuel Grice. He knew my mother. Priya nodded. All right, stay there. Don't move back into the property yet. Legally, it makes things cleaner if you don't take possession until we have the paperwork. And Mrs. Callahan, she paused. Do your children know about this? Not yet, Dorothy said. There was a moment between them, the knowing kind, the kind that passes between women who understand precisely what not yet means when a woman of 78 says it about her adult children. You might want to keep it that way, Priya said carefully, until we have the deed in your name. She took Priya's advice. For 3 weeks, she told no one. She stayed in Samuel's back bedroom, which his daughter Constance had made up with fresh linens, and a vase of zinnias from the garden, and a small electric fan she said would help with the September heat. Constance Grice was 58 years old and had her father's clear eyes and her own considerable warmth, and she was the kind of woman who feeds people when she doesn't know what else to do, which meant that Dorothy ate well and slept surprisingly deeply and felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, the low-grade hum of being in a place where she was genuinely wanted. In the evenings, she and Samuel sat on his porch. They talked about Aliner. He had small stories stored up like provisions, the way she had laughed at her own jokes, the way she had always had an opinion about politicians, the particular expression she wore when she thought someone was being a fool but had decided not to say so. Each story was a small gift. Dorothy received them all. She was in Samuel's kitchen on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week when her phone rang with Vincent's number. The word had gotten out, she didn't know how, perhaps through Priya's inquiries with the county records office, perhaps through simple small-town osmosis, and what had gotten out was enough, that Dorothy Callahan had a claim on a piece of property and a legal process underway. Mom, Vincent's voice had changed in a way she recognized immediately, the particular texture of warmth in a person who has decided warmth is suddenly useful. I've been thinking about you. We all have. We're sorry, Mom, about how things went. She listened to him speak. She listened to Karen call 3 days later, crying in the practiced way of a woman who has used tears to good effect in the past. She listened to Darren, who was the youngest and the bluntest and who said, in the closest thing to honesty any of them managed, "We just want to know you're okay." I'm okay, she told each of them, and she was polite, and she was warm, and she said nothing that wasn't true, but she did not tell them what Priya had found. She did not describe the tin box, the insurance policy, or the deed. She listened to their apologies with the same attention she had given Samuel's stories about Eleanor, and she filed those apologies away in a part of herself that would examine them later, carefully, in good light, the way you examine something that might be real or might be paste, and you won't know which until you look closely enough. She was not foolish. She had not become foolish. On a Wednesday morning, 7 weeks after Dorothy Callahan had stood on the sidewalk of Sycamore Lane with a suitcase and an iron key, Priya Anand called with the news. The estate had been cleared, the deed transferred, and 14 Millbrook Hollow Road was now legally, officially, unambiguously the property of Dorothy Me Callahan. The life insurance policy, 30 years of accumulated value, the premiums long since paid and the balance grown past anything Eleanor had originally intended, released a check for $47,000 to the sole named beneficiary. Dorothy sat at Samuel's kitchen table, held Priya's letter in both hands, and looked at the figure for a long time. She did not feel triumphant. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She had expected to feel triumphant, and instead she felt something older and more complete than that. She felt the way a person feels when they arrive somewhere they have been trying to reach for a very long time, and the arriving is both a destination and a homecoming, and the two things are so intertwined that you can no longer separate them. She felt her mother's hands. The renovation took 3 months. She hired 2 young men from town whom Samuel vouched for, and she worked alongside them when her knees allowed and directed them with precise authority when they didn't. She had lived in enough houses to know what a house needed. She knew a settling foundation from a failing one. She knew how to strip old paint and what lay beneath it. She knew which walls could come down and which ones were holding the ceiling up, and she said this in a way that made the young men listen to her the first time. She kept the wide plank floors. She replaced the porch supports and the broken window glass. She had the cedar in the attic cleaned and sealed and kept exactly as it was, because she had decided the attic would stay as her mother had made it, private, cedar-smelling, full of the quality of light that comes through a window that has stopped trying to be transparent and become something more like stained glass. She painted the front of the house white, a true white, the white of fresh plaster and fresh starts. She turned the front room into a sewing shop. This was not sentimentality. This was the intention. She ordered a good commercial machine, not expensive but solid, the kind built for sustained work. She refinished the wooden worktable she found in the back room, which she understood now had been her mother's worktable, the original surface still bearing the faint ghost of cut lines and pin marks and the small brown circles of a pressing cloth left too long on a seam. She hung a sign on the repaired front porch, CALLEHANS, ALTRATIONS, and sewing, walk-ins welcome. The community's response was not explosive. It was the better kind of response, the quiet kind, the word-of-mouth kind, the kind that builds in the way that things built by hand build, steadily and with intention. A woman brought in a wedding dress for fitting adjustments. A man needed 3 pairs of trousers hemmed. A teenage girl came with a vintage coat she'd found at an estate sale and asked Dorothy to take it in at the waist, and Dorothy did it, and the girl came back with 3 friends. By November, Dorothy had a waiting list. She called Vincent first. She told him clearly and without rancor what she expected: consistent contact, genuine presence, no more decisions made on her behalf without her knowledge, and a willingness to sit in a room with her and have an honest conversation about the previous year. She told him he could earn her trust back the way all trust is earned, over time through action, without rushing. To his credit, Vincent said yes without negotiating the terms. He came the following Sunday and sat at her kitchen table and was quiet when she spoke and didn't make it about himself, and only once looked as though he might cry, which he had the dignity not to. It was a beginning, small and imperfect and real. Karen called and wept again, and Dorothy listened with patience and said, "I hear you, Karen. Come when you're ready to listen as much as you talk." Karen said she would, whether she would remain to be seen. Darren sent a card with $50 tucked inside it and a note that said, "I don't know what else to say, Mom." She appreciated the honesty of it. She sent the $50 back and wrote on the card, "What I need from you is not money. Come visit. Try not to be a stranger." She was not bitter. Bitterness is a substance that costs the person carrying it more than it costs anyone else, and Dorothy had decided long ago that she would not carry things that cost more than they were worth. But she was clear-eyed in the way that comes from having seen the truth about people in an unguarded moment, the kind of truth you cannot unsee. She held what she knew with the same quiet firmness with which she held a good seam, steady, even, without pulling too hard in either direction. She was done bending for people who wouldn't hold her weight in return. It was a warm evening in September, the following September, a full year on from the sidewalk, when Dorothy sat down in the repaired rocking chair on the front porch of the white house on Millbrook Hollow Road and let the evening come to her. Samuel was beside her in his own chair, an old cane-backed rocker he'd carried across the road 2 months ago when Dorothy had finally insisted he simply move in, which he'd done with the unhurried dignity of a man who has waited all his life for someone to ask. His daughter Constance visited on Wednesdays and Sundays and sometimes stayed for supper, and those evenings had become the architecture of the week, the thing everything else was arranged around. The yard was still wild. Dorothy had decided to keep it that way, had only cleared the paths and the vegetable beds she'd planted along the south wall, had let the goldenrod and the ironweed and the wisteria have their way with the rest. The persimmon tree near the stone wall was ripening now, its small orange fruits heavy in the lowering light. The honeysuckle had climbed higher up the cedar since last year. The whole property smelled of it on evenings like this, sweet and slightly wild and entirely itself. Inside, her sewing machine was quiet for the day, her work table cleared, a dress half finished on the form that she would return to in the morning. The front room smelled of clean cotton and ironing, and the faint cedar coming down from the attic above, and sometimes when she walked through it in the early morning, before the shop opened, she would stop and stand in the middle of that smell and breathe it in and feel the unambiguous weight of her mother's presence there, the way the dead returned to us not in apparitions, but in the smell of the rooms they built. Dorothy reached into the neck of her blouse and drew out the iron key on its silver chain. She held it in her palm, the same way she had held it on the sidewalk of Sycamore Lane a year ago, the dark iron warm from her skin. She looked at it for a long time. Samuel rocked slowly beside her. The wood thrush was singing somewhere in the trees behind the property. The September light was doing what September light in Tennessee does, softening everything at the edges, turning the ordinary into something that glowed from the inside, making the evening look, for a little while, the way it feels to finally be home. Dorothy closed her fist around the key and tilted her face toward the sky. "I heard you, Mama," she said quietly. "I finally heard you." There is a story told in many forms, across many cultures in many centuries, but its essential truth never changes. It is the story of the woman who gave and gave and gave until she had given everything, and who discovered at the last possible moment, or what seemed like the last possible moment, that everything she had given away was not, in fact, everything she had. There are women like Evicted Callahan in every family, in every town, on every street, women who worked in silence and saved in silence and planned in silence because the world they lived in offered no other option, because the speaking of it would have been the losing of it, because the price of being seen was the price of being claimed. These women ironed other people's shirts before dawn. They let out other people's hems by lamplight. They pressed their savings into tin boxes wrapped in aprons and carried their hopes in small iron keys and held their tongues for 40 years and longer. They are not in the history books. They are in our bloodlines. They are in the smell of cedar and the creak of floorboards and the way certain kinds of light fall across a room we have never been in before and feel, somehow, like we've known it all our lives. To know these women is to know this. What they left us is never only material. Not the deed, not the tin box, not the $47,000 of accumulated value. What they left us is the proof that it is possible to carry your dignity through circumstances that should have stripped it from you, and arrive on the other side of those circumstances still standing, still upright, still yourself. What they left us is the knowledge that a woman can be the quietest person in the room and still be the most powerful one. What Evicted Callahan left her daughter Dorothy was not a house, it was a door. We speak often in comfortable platitudes about the importance of family, but there is family by blood and there is family by choice, and it is sometimes necessary for a person to arrive at a place where they can see the difference clearly and make their decisions accordingly. The people who drove away from that sidewalk, and the man who sat beside her on a repaired porch on a warm September evening, these are different kinds of love, held in different chambers of the same heart. The love for Vincent and Karen and Darren is the love of history, of shared origin, of people you cannot unknow, even when you wish you could. The love for Samuel and Constance is the love of the present tense of people who show up, who offer water and a place to sit, who carry chairs across roads for you. Neither is lesser, but only one is freely given, and Dorothy Callahan, who had spent 78 years trying to earn the first kind, had learned to receive the second kind with both hands open. And if you are watching this, if you have stayed with this story to its end, perhaps because something in it touched the part of you that has felt invisible, perhaps because you know what it is to have your needs dismissed, your contributions forgotten, your worthiness made contingent on your usefulness to someone else. Perhaps because you yourself have stood on some sidewalk, metaphorical or literal, and watched the taillights disappear and wondered what comes next. If that is you, then hear this. It is not too late. It is never, not once, not ever too late to come home to yourself. The door exists. The key is in your pocket. You have been carrying it longer than you know. Somewhere tonight, in a white clapboard house on a road lined with old-growth trees, a woman in a rocking chair is holding a small iron key on a chain around her neck, and she is listening to the wood thrush sing, and she is at peace. Well, she is at peace.